Welcome to the Tigray Humanitarian Update. I'm your host, Duke Burbridge. It's going to be a short show tonight. We're just going to be looking at some of the more credible sources of data about the humanitarian response in Tigray. Unfortunately, it's been a very noisy environment as far as data goes. We get a lot of data that isn't credible, a lot of sources that are traced back to the Ethiopian government, which is not reliable. We know for a fact that the Ethiopian government cannot be trusted with this sort of information. In September, a UN-mandated commission found cause to believe that the Ethiopian government was committing war crimes, crimes against humanity in Tigray, using food as a weapon of war, using food to subjugate the innocent civilians of Tigray. Now, 3 months later, we're trusting them to collect the data about food distribution in Tigray. That is an astonishing lack of concern for human life. This show is going to do the best it can of sifting the real facts from the bullshit. That's what we do. Hopefully it'll get easier, but I don't know if it will. So on that note, let's start the show. As of November 23rd, food aid was still blocked from reaching more than 4 million of the 5.4 million Tigrayans who need food assistance. This reporting week ends 21 days from the peace agreement in Pretoria, during which the Ethiopian government agreed to grant unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray. This has still not happened. What I want to do is take a look at food dispatch and distribution over the past 5 weeks of the current food distribution round. I want to look at two focus areas. There's no reliable information about the current lines of control in Tigray, but there are approximate areas held by either the federal government, the Amhara regional government, or in some cases the Eritrean military. Many of these areas are also difficult to reach because of government restrictions on fuel and their proximity or their lack of proximity to the capital. So these are areas that it's been difficult to get food into. The bubbles with the numbers represent the last week that there was a change in status. This is week 1. So all of the bubbles are from week 1. Week 1 numbers can be misleading because they include week 1 but also everything that happened prior to the food round starting. This is a common practice that, let's say there's a district that needs 10 metric tons of food to feed the population in need. Sometimes they'll dispatch 15 metric tons of food. So you'll have the 10 for the current round and then 5 metric tons for the next round. So actually the food dispatch for the next round began in the previous round, if that makes sense. Unfortunately, this type of accounting is not good for conflict situations because in conflict, when there's an invading army such as the Eritrean army or the Ethiopian army that has been credibly accused of stealing food stocks, then any pre-positioned dispatched food is at risk, at serious risk of being stolen. So you don't know how much food is still out there. If you sent 5 tons of food extra from the previous round, you cannot be sure that that 5 tons is still there after an invading army comes through. And if you want to know what it looks like when a military steals pre-positioned food supplies from a humanitarian agency, you can look no further than social media. I'm sure we've all seen the post of the Ethiopian military liberating stockpiles of TPLF supplies that look a lot like humanitarian assistance. That's because it is humanitarian assistance. If the TDF did this, it would be called looting and theft and a war crime. When the Ethiopian military does this, they have liberated the food. So I guess it's a long way of saying that the data from week 1 can be misleading, particularly in a conflict situation, particularly when you have an army that is taking pictures of food that's been liberated from the enemy that looks a lot like humanitarian assistance and posting them on the internet. So there's no real good reason to believe that a lot of that stockpile still exists for the humanitarian agencies to then go back into areas that have been taken over by the Eritrean or Ethiopian military and distribute food. After week 1, the status changes in each district become more indicative of actual activity as far as the humanitarian response goes. So if a district goes from not yet begun dispatch to dispatch ongoing, that means that dispatch started that week. The same thing with food distribution. If you look at the second week of the current food distribution round, which ended on November 2nd, which was the day that the Ethiopian government signed an agreement that guaranteed unhindered humanitarian access to Tigray, you can see that only 3 districts began dispatch in the focus areas that we're looking at. You can also see that no new districts received dispatch. No food was moving at that point out of Mekelle to areas that needed food distribution, at least in the focus area that we were looking at. They didn't have any more fuel. Now, this is because fuel had been banned from entering Tigray from, at that point, it had been about 2 months since the last time fuel was allowed into Tigray. Now, at this point, there's a signed agreement for unhindered humanitarian access. Humanitarian agencies report that they can be ready to go with a couple hours lead time with food and fuel and medicine and desperately needed humanitarian supplies. But when you look at the third week, you see that only 4 new districts have begun distribution, and again, no districts have received dispatch in the focus areas that we're looking at. 0. Aid trucks continue to stand by. They're ready to move within a couple hours, but no authorization has been granted by the federal government. This is a week after they promised in writing to grant unhindered humanitarian access into Tigray. In the next week, food distribution begins in 2 more places. This is also the week that the Ethiopian government again promised in Nairobi to grant humanitarian access to Tigray unhindered, but it still hasn't happened. But this is where you begin to see very small convoys of trucks starting to move into Tigray. The first was, I think, a convoy of 2 Red Cross trucks into Mekelle. This was followed by a couple more. We'll get into how those deliveries unfolded in a second. This brings us to the most recent update for the current food distribution round. This is the week ending 23 November, which is 3 full weeks since the Ethiopian government promised unhindered humanitarian access for 5.4 million starving Tigrayan civilians. You can see that unhindered access has not happened. In the Northwest Zone, there are a couple of places that begun dispatch or distribution from a small convoy that entered there, likewise in the Southern Zone. In the Central Zone and the Eastern Zone, it appears that a great deal of districts have received dispatch. Now, this data is a little bit controversial because this is after the logistics cluster, which is the cluster that sort of tracks movement of humanitarian assistance. They began publishing reports jointly with the Ethiopian government. Now, let's put that into perspective. The logistics cluster has begun issuing reports, joint reports, with a government that's suspected of using weaponized starvation against the civilian population of this region. The red dots on this next map indicate districts where there's been no humanitarian activity whatsoever. I may have missed a few districts in here that aren't large enough to show up on the map, but this is just a cursory glance of how many districts have had no humanitarian activity whatsoever for more than a month. These are either places that there's been no dispatch or places where dispatch was reported in the first week but have not moved to distribution since then. These are hindrances. This is 21 days after the Ethiopian government guaranteed humanitarian aid would be able to enter Tigray without any hindrances whatsoever. These are severe hindrances, and they're killing innocent civilians. Innocent families are being killed. In the areas where there are red dots, this is where people are dying of starvation and being blocked from accessing humanitarian assistance during a time now of peace. They're being blocked. There are 2 ways to look at the problem here. Now, one way is quite simply, these are areas that are under Ethiopian government control. This is where food's not getting in. It's still not getting into places where the Ethiopian government either controls the area, the district, has a presence there, or they control the pipeline, the highway going to those areas. That's still a significant challenge. 3 weeks after unhindered humanitarian access is guaranteed, it's still not being allowed into those areas. There's another way of looking at it. The areas that have seemed to have the most problem are the places that are being serviced by the World Food Program. Now, this is, of course, indicative of A couple of things. One, the World Food Program is, now for a while, it was being said that the World Food Program couldn't get food into these areas because there wasn't any fuel, because it had been repossessed by the TPLF based on previous loan. This is according to the TPLF. There's been no real confirmation. The World Food Program accused them of stealing and then went completely silent on it when they produced a receipt. Either way, this was a bad move to take this fuel. However, that happened several months ago. There's been no fuel allowed since then. That cannot be the excuse anymore. That couldn't be the excuse more than a week after it happened. It can't be an excuse anymore. Now there's unhindered humanitarian access. So why are they still having problems getting food into all of these places? Now this is not intended as criticism of the staff of the World Food Program or their implementing partners who are working in Tigray right now under very dangerous and difficult circumstances. They seem to be doing an outstanding job. This is a problem with leadership. Now let's look at deliveries by the World Food Program into Tigray since the government agreed to allow unhindered humanitarian access. According to the World Food Program, they only delivered 96 trucks of food in the first 3 weeks of unhindered humanitarian access. Now, according to the Ethiopian Government, who put out a press release after that it scaled up to 182 trucks over the next 4 days, which would be a great 4-day total. But why on earth would it take almost a month for them to get to that point, to where they were bringing the humanitarian delivery to scale? Sadly, there's been no indication from anybody connected to the peace agreement, anybody who was involved in the negotiation, anybody involved in the implementation or the monitoring, whoever they may be, because that's been a little bit of a foggy area, but there's been no public statement to find the Ethiopian government at fault for starving tens of thousands of Tigrayan civilians after signing a peace agreement, after agreeing to unhindered humanitarian access. That didn't start for at least 3 weeks now. It's still hindered. That still hasn't started as of the 23rd of November. There's been no condemnation. That shows you the value of Tigrayan civilian life in these negotiations. That has been the order from day one. They have been expecting Tigrayan civilians to starve for this peace process to work. That's been an unspoken reality, is that if it's not acceptable for Tigrayan children to starve to death with their parents in isolation from the entire world, then we can't have peace. That's the price of peace. And they paid it. The civilians paid the price for peace. They paid the price for war, and they paid the price for peace. That's the world we're living in today. That's where peace building is today. It is remarkable that the United States government participated in a peace process that led to the death of so many innocent civilians. Unfortunately, this show has to end with a question mark, because there's no way to really understand with a degree of certainty where the humanitarian response in Tigray is at right now. What we do know for certain is that the Ethiopian government will be providing many of the updates for how that response is going. This is the same government that created the humanitarian crisis and held 7 million people in a state of famine for more than a year. The only thing we can hope for right now is that they got what they want. Let's hope that the Ethiopian government is satisfied with the amount of suffering they've inflicted on the people of Tigray, satisfied enough to allow food into Tigray. Because for now, the United States, the United Nations, the African Union, they're doing nothing to protect the people of Tigray. It's as it's always been. For 2 years, they're on their own. And God protect the innocent civilians of Tigray.